That is why we read the second gospel passage, Matthew 19. It's a passage that talks about eunuchs. Who were these people called eunuchs? James, if you'll give me the next slide. Eunuchs were a class of servants in the ancient world responsible for supervising and guarding the living quarters of women, of the women of the palace or women of wealthy households. Now, one of the deep concerns that the ancient masters, of the household had, whether they were the king or simply a wealthy man, one of the concerns you would have with eunuchs, and the position of eunuch was always filled by males, was that one of your eunuchs would have an affair with one of the women in your harem. Or, worse yet, rape one of the women in your harem, thereby impregnating them and clouding, confusing the lines of inheritance. And the lines of inheritance were very important in ancient times. So if you were the master of a household looking to hire someone to be a eunuch and watch after your women in close proximity with them, who would be the perfect candidate? Some man who had the reputation for being interested in men instead of women, right? This position was tailor-made for male homosexuals. Not to mention the fact that what self-respecting male homosexual would not give his right arm in order to live among the king's harem and be able to consult with these women on their clothes and their hair fashions for a career. I mean, this position was perfect, right? A magnet for homosexual males. And guess what? In the ancient literature of the time, that is what we see. Abundant evidence that there was a stereotype that associated eunuchs with what we today call male homosexuality. For example, in the Old Testament, an Old Testament book in the Catholic Bible, the book of Sirach, chapter 30 and verse 20, says that when a eunuch embraces a woman, he groans. I think it was the Roman poet Lucian who said, some of you guys understand this, don't you? The ancient Roman poet Lucian, I believe it was, who said that a eunuch has as much need for a woman as a bald man for a comb. The Kama Sutra, which was an Indian sacred text in the ancient world, has a whole chapter talking about how eunuchs supposedly seduced other men. Getting the picture? Now, those are just 3 sites. Many more are cited in the book. But as you survey the ancient literature, you see again and again references to a stereotype that assumed that eunuchs were disinterested in women and affirmatively interested in men. Now, I'm not saying that every eunuch was a homosexual, just that so many of them were that in the popular mind the two became associated. Introducing yourself as a eunuch in the ancient world would be akin to today introducing yourself as a hairdresser from San Francisco. You may not be, but there's a lot of suspicion. This is the relationship between the two categories. Now, some eunuchs were castrated. Some masters, out of an abundance of caution, would castrate their eunuchs to be sure that there would be no impregnation. But we know from ancient literature that many eunuchs were not castrated. They were referred to as natural or born eunuchs. Eunuchs who consistently showed a disinterest in women and interest in men. We find a very interesting discussion of natural-born eunuchs in the ancient Jewish Talmud. The Talmud was compiled in written form several hundred years after the time of Christ, but is based on oral traditions that go back to and beyond the time of Christ. So the Talmud gives us an excellent snapshot of cultural thinking in and around the time of Jesus Christ. In the Jewish Talmud, Rabbi Eliezer speaks about natural eunuchs and allows as how he thinks they can be cured. Does that sound familiar? There's another place where the Talmud talks about the warning signs that you may be dealing with a natural-born eunuch. After all, you don't want to be surprised by things like this. And so there's a warning list there. James, if you'll give me the next slide, here are some of the things they say to watch out for. A man with soft hair, a sparse beard, a high-pitched voice, smoothness of skin, urine that does not arc, or a body that does not steam when bathing in winter. You recognize what this is? This is the ancient equivalent of the modern stereotype that effeminacy equals homosexuality. Except back then, I guess they thought if you were a manly man, you would pee with enough force to create an arc. If you were a manly man back then, when you took a bath in the winter, your body would steam because manly men generate lots of heat, you know. Here's the stereotype, so that you would know if you were dealing, and it was important to know if you were dealing with a eunuch, because you see, eunuchs were deemed unclean. Eunuchs were banned from the presence of the Jewish temple. But remember, Jesus swept away in Mark 7 the basis for that kind of thinking. And then he closes the circle in our second reading in Matthew chapter 19, where he talks about eunuchs. Now, the context of the passage in Matthew 19 is that the Pharisees have asked Jesus a question about divorce. And Jesus responds by saying Moses allowed divorce as a concession to human weakness. But, Jesus says, that's not God's ideal. God's ideal, Jesus says, is one man, one woman, in marriage together forever. Aha! Some of our Christian brothers and sisters will say, there it is! Creation order thinking, right in the words of Jesus. But you have to read the rest of the passage. Because after Jesus says that, his disciples say to him, you know, if that's the way it is, if divorce is permissible only under narrow circumstances and is not consistent with God's will, then maybe the disciples say it is better for a man not to marry. And Jesus responds to that beginning in verse 10 by saying, not everyone can receive this, but only those to whom it is given. And then Jesus lists three categories of men who are not meant in God's order of things to marry women. Let's look at that verse. Verse 12. Matthew 19, verse 12. Jesus says, there are eunuchs who have been so from birth. And there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others. And there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let anyone accept this who can. Let anyone accept this who can. Let's go in reverse order. Jesus mentions at the end of this verse, eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. What would be a modern example of someone who fits this category? A Catholic priest, or a Catholic nun if you flip the gender. What is the most prominent biblical example of someone who lived in this third category? Paul. The most prominent, though, would be Jesus. It is fascinating to me that when looking for words to describe the class to which he belonged, Jesus chose a term that he knew full well had all of these connotations with homosexuality that we've just talked about. Now, I'm not saying that Jesus was trying to wink at us and hint that he was homosexual. What I'm saying is that there is an abundant absence in the words of Jesus of any homophobia. Can you imagine Jerry Falwell describing himself with a word that has connotations of homosexuality? Can you imagine Jerry Falwell saying to his TV church audience, yesterday I felt kind of queer? No, he would never talk that way because he knows that when you say queer, even though it's a normal English word, that it has all those connotations. And yet here is Jesus using a word with all those connotations to describe the category that he's from. But that's not all. He goes on. The middle category here are eunuchs who have been made so by others. These would be the castrated, those who have been castrated. But look at the first category. Jesus says there are eunuchs who have been so from birth. Here is Jesus' understanding of creation order. He says the predominant paradigm is one man, one woman in marriage, and we can celebrate with Jesus that that is God's will for the vast majority of humanity, but he's careful to point out that there are a minority of us who are meant by God to follow a different path that is also honored and beautiful in the eyes of God. This is good news that we ought to be shouting from every mountain